All right, welcome to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Campus County Connection webinar series. Today's topic is predicted invasive fish from Eurasia. Are there more invasive fish coming to North America? And we're here with Dave McNeil, Extension Associate from Sea Grant, and Dave, who also goes by Mac, has been working for Sea Grant for 27 years?
Yes.
Right. So he's going to inform us a little bit about invasive fish, and I want to encourage you throughout the session to think about questions that you have and chat them in. If you could take a moment to make sure that your chat is set to all participants, that will ensure that all of your colleagues that are on will also see your question, because the question that you have may be the question that somebody else has. So at any time, chat in your questions, and we'll stop regularly to answer those. But for now, we're going to move on to Mac's presentation. So take it away.
Thank you, Celeste, and thank you very much for taking time out of everyone's busy schedule to sit in on this webinar. And I just wanted to apologize if I offended any Yankees fans for wearing that Boston Red Sox hat out there. Anyway, what I'd like to do today is just talk to you a little bit about two Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects with which I was involved. One of the things that I've always found so interesting about working with Extension is that it's never a dull moment. There's always some issue that rockets into the forefront, and certainly the invasive species is one that's kept us all very busy over the last several years. And being involved in such interesting issues gives us the opportunity to work with some of the top researchers in the country. And that's certainly no exception here. I'd like to thank Dr. Randy Snyder, Dr. Lubia Berlikova, and Alexander Karatea from Buffalo State College, who did actually all of the scientific analysis and the translation of a lot of literature from Russian that was previously unavailable. I am the extension guy here, trying to just deliver the message to my audiences. So what I'd like to do is just begin with a very short history lesson. Now, you probably think that I've lost my mind already, but there is, I use this example here as a really good metaphor for explaining the concepts of uncertainty and risk, and we'll be referring to that throughout this presentation. Now, you all remember the story about Wild Bill Hickok. He was in a bar, and someone came up and shot him, and he was holding this particular hand of cards, black aces and eights, and forever after, this was called the dead man's hand and considered to be unlucky. So there's we can look at this as sort of a metaphor for understanding the concepts of uncertainty and risk. And the uncertainty being, what poker hand will I draw next? And the risk is probably less than 1%. And we associate risk of getting shot, and that's one way of looking at it. So that's basically a kind of a layman's way of trying to understand these concepts of risk and uncertainty. And some of the odds makers in Las Vegas have been able to predict with a great deal of accuracy what are the most likely hands of winning in a poker game. And basically, underneath that curve is about 50% chance of, those are the most likely combinations of winning a poker game. Now, all that said, when we take a look at invasive species and we talk about the concepts of risk and uncertainty, it is in no way this precise. In fact, we know that Mother Nature shuffles the cards around so we can get all new combinations of cards, so that kind of throws our understanding of trying to make predictions of risk and uncertainty very, very difficult. So most of you have probably seen this before, but this is basically what we call the process of species invasions, and most people don't realize that most species invasions fail, because they fail at probably combination of each one of these steps or at one of them. You know, uptake from the native range, transport by some sort of vector, their release and arrival, and establishment. Scientists use this term called propagule pressure. I don't know how many people have heard of that, but again, this is going to be pretty science-like presentation, but propagule pressure has to do with the frequency of introduction, the number of organisms that are introduced, the number of different locations of its native range, and so on. And invasions can fail at each one of these. And one of the things that we've learned over time is that, well, for one thing, the number of papers or research projects looking at species invasions has basically gone almost logarithmic since the 1950s, and especially after the zebra mussels got here in the late 1980s. This whole phenomenon of invasion ecology has just taken right off, and it's a very exciting but a very complex field. So, that said, we do know that at least 70% of the species invasions into the Great Lakes have occurred since probably the late 1950s with the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway, and just recognize that these ships and their home ports in Eurasia or wherever they're coming from contain large numbers of ballast tanks through which they maintain stability during their transoceanic voyages. Now, these ballast tanks on some of these larger tankers are really pretty voluminous. In fact, many of them are at least 90 feet deep. And so the idea is when they're in their home ports, they take large amounts of ballast water aboard these ballast tanks to provide them with the stability of the transoceanic voyage. And we do know that many of these transplanted organisms have been introduced and have been part of our Great Lakes and ecosystems as well as other places in North America. Now, we do know that most of the invasions have come from Eurasia, either directly from the Black, Caspian Sea areas, as well as some secondary transport from the Baltic Sea region. And apparently, the construction of a lot of canals in Central Europe have certainly facilitated the transport of some of these Pono-Caspian species into the Baltic Ocean, and the Baltic Sea rather, where they've been transported into the Great Lakes. Now, there's also another region that we're starting to look at right now as far as a donor source of new invasives, which we really haven't thought about. And what we're looking at right now is the transport of windmill parts from Asia, especially from Singapore and Vietnam, which could mean that we could have some additional species introductions from those particular areas. And I guess the big concern there is that many of these potential ballast water transports from Asia could be human pathogens and parasites. Now, so this is not really what I would recommend as a conventional means of controlling ballast water. This idea was brought up to me by a couple of my charter boat captain friends. So obviously, since the arrival of the zebra mussel and several other invaders into the Great Lakes, there's been a lot of intensive effort looking at, well, how do we control these ballast water invasions? And there have been a number of efforts underway to try and reduce the threat from ballast water transport. And early on, I think back in the late 1980s, it was recommended to shipping companies that they, during their mid-oceanic voyage, to exchange their freshwater ballast that they pick up their home ports with full-strength seawater. And that was actually mandated, I think, by the early 2000s. Now, there's another means that they've really introduced. So there's really, I should point out, there's two ways of controlling ballast water transport. One being the open ocean exchange, in which ballast waters are pumped and fresh water or salt water is pumped back in with the idea of killing some of these potential invaders. But that has since been followed up by a mandated, I think either 2006 or 2009, ballast water flushing. So essentially what happens is when they do the full oceanic exchange, that's about a 95% volumetric exchange. But there's still a lot of residual seawater and muck inside there. So what happens during some of these flushing events is that there's a series of pumping of seawater into the ballast tanks to try and remove some of this residual debris. And in effect, this has probably reduced the chance of ballast water transport to North America by at least 70%, depending on what literature that you look at. So another problem that we faced here in terms of trying to understand the dynamics, behavior, and ecology of some of these Eurasian species has obviously been a language barrier. There's a lot of information published in former Soviet bloc countries which has been previously unavailable. And one of the essences of the first phase of this project was to go through some of this Russian literature and translate it into English so we can have more biological information on some of these predicted invaders. And I think we can thank two things for this. The arrival of the zebra mussel first really got our attention to the ballast water problem because of its really pernicious behavior. And also followed, it's kind of ironic, in 1989, shortly after the zebra mussels got here, the Berlin Wall collapsed, and certainly both those events perhaps encouraged greater scientific dialogue. But still, there was a lot of information that needed to be translated into English. And this, in essence, was a very important part of this particular project. I had no role in this because I still have a lot of trouble with English sometimes. So what was done was using this translated information plus other published reports, we were able to identify some potentially invasive Pono-Caspian fish. And we identified basically 10 fish, or 10 Pono-Caspian fish, as invasion risks in North America. And Doctors Berlikova and Karateev did the translation. They looked at some of this information on 42 Pono-Caspian fish, and with some of the other previously described literature indicating that 28 of these had some invasion potential. Now, there's a lot of ways in which researchers have tried to describe risk and prediction, and I won't go into those because there's a myriad of different techniques, but what they use is a very robust multivariate statistical model called discriminant analysis, and for information on that, I suggest you contact the co-authors of the paper that was produced here. I took multivariate statistics about 10 years ago, and I've basically forgotten everything. But anyway, of these 10 species, 5 species were previously identified as high risk by an early paper by Kohler and Lodge in 2002. But using the translated information, they identified 5 additionally potential invasive species from the Pono-Caspian. Now, of those 10 species, 4 were designated as having a high invasive potential, 4 with a moderate invasion potential, and 2 with a low invasive potential. And this is based entirely upon their ability to survive ballast water transport. Now, another very important part of this was to identify native species in the Great Lakes as, I guess, surrogates that have similar life requirements to some of these potential invaders. So if you're out doing fisheries assessment work and you find some of these native indicator species, it also might give you a target for where to look for some of these potential invaders. And what Drs. Berlikova and Karateev did is they looked through an extensive collection of information from some of their former colleagues in Belarus, and did an incredible amount of research, which was previously unavailable to North American workers. So basically what happened here, and again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but what was basically compiled was translated information on such things as life history and ecology. Life history being such things as growth rates, what age they retire, I'm not retired, but mature. Such things as egg size or the number of eggs they produced and their reproductive behavior. Ecology would refer to their salinity, temperature preferences, their habitats, their diets, and particularly important, their invasion history. Many of these species have well-documented invasion history in the Pono-Caspian area and into the Baltic. Now, what essentially happens after you have this information, you can use a variety of different models here. And as I said before, there's a myriad of different models here, looking at what we call native range models, where you identify the characteristics of the donor region. The invasion model is used to predict the areas where it could potentially spread. And the mixed model is actually used to compare actual invasions with the prediction invasions. And there's also a variety of models called vector models to identify potential invasion pathways. And this gives us the wherewithal to do some pre-screening and risk assessment. And again, this is another wide open area in which there are a multitude of different techniques to undergo your risk or to perform your risk assessment. So again, here are the 10 risky species. At least 5 of those were previously identified by Kohler and Lodge, those with potential invasion risk. And the newly identified potential invaders were the result of this particular study with which I was involved. And of these 10, 4 of them were designated as a high risk for ballast survival, 4 is a moderate risk for ballast water survival, and 2 being a low risk for ballast water survival and transport to the Great Lakes.
So, Mac, I'm going to stop you for a second just with a question. And I want to encourage anybody else that has questions to chat them into the chat box. But my question would be, so is the risk of something coming in through ballast water, that's the greatest potential for move?
For these species, although there are some of them that could be easily transported through the aquarium industry, which is often overlooked.
Okay.
So particularly those low risk for ballast water survival, those species, especially the Eurasian minnow, if that were introduced through the aquarium trade, that could be a really nasty little species to have over here. So it's not just ballast water that we need to keep an eye on.
Gotcha.
But that was essentially the focus of this particular study.
Thank you.
So the first one, this was also identified in an earlier study. This is called the Kilka, Russian being Chulka, also called the Black Sea Sprat. The scientific name is Clupionella cultraventris. It is a member of the herring family, and as such have a propensity to be in open waters, and they school. Now, if you think about invasion pathways, any group of fishes that form dense aggregations, whether they're near the bottom or in open waters, any schooling fish is highly vulnerable to be withdrawn aboard ballast waters. And generally what we've seen of all the groups of fishes that are most likely to be taken aboard ballast tank, tanks, it includes members of the herring family and the gobies, which is why these are species that we really have to keep a close eye on. So I mean, this is a typical herring. I mean, they eat largely invertebrates, freshwater shrimp, much like what alewife do. They also eat small fish, and there's also the potential for them to be competitors and predators on small fish. Now, during the 1950s, there's an extensive hydropower damming efforts underway in the former Soviet Union. And large reservoir systems, one in particular, Kubyshev Reservoir, and I think it's on the Volga. One of the things I noticed that after the Black Sea Sprat was established there, it basically, and again, crowded out, that was the language that was used in the paper, native fish, especially smelt and whitefish, which is very much similar to how the alewife, a similar species, affected the Great Lakes. So they, you know, very much like a typical herring, they grow to about 5 or 6 inches in length, live 3 to 6 years, and they have a very high fecundity, or egg production. They produce large numbers of very small eggs. Now, a related species is the Caspian sea kilka. Now, this was newly identified as a high-risk species to North America, not necessarily because of, not necessarily to the Great Lakes, because this has a considerably higher salinity tolerance than the previous species. Now, the problem you have with this particular fish is that it is not really clear to taxonomists that it is either a separate species or a subspecies of the earlier species that I just showed you. And morphologically, the only way you can tell the difference between the Caspian sea kilka and the Black Sea is that the pelvic and pectoral fins, some of the little fin rays that stick off the fins, are about 3% shorter. So there's really very difficult to tell the difference between the two species. The only real difference is that this has a higher salinity tolerance. So unlikely to invade the Great Lakes, more likely to invade brackish waters. And also, kilkas, I should have mentioned, is a very popular food fish in a lot of the Baltic states and in some of the Pondo-Caspian areas. So these are readily available online on Amazon, and we're all waiting for Rachel Ray to pick up on this to come up with some kilka recipes.
Have you tried it?
I've never tried it, no.
Well, that's definitely the question I had looking at this. Well, if they're coming, can we eat them?
My understanding is that they're served in tomato sauce, and with the reason being that they're very strong, fishy taste. So that's, for me, that wouldn't encourage me to go out and buy a couple of cans.
There you go.
Now, another one is another species identified as a moderate invasion risk by this particular studies, and quite possibly the Great Lakes. This is the Black Sea shad. Scientific name is Alosa meatica, and the significance of that is that this is very closely related to another invasive species, very common native species in the Great Lakes, the alewife. So if it were introduced, it's likely to be quite successful. The difficulty might be in trying to discriminate this between your basic alewife that you see in the Great Lakes. Although we suspect that it would, if it were introduced, it would be a deeper dwelling, cooler water species than alewife. And like I said, it's a typical herring family member, basically feeding on small fish and other small invertebrates. And I should mention that there are at least 6 other species of Alosa in the Pondo-Caspian area that deserve watching as well. But this one was deemed as a higher risk than some of the others. Now, what I want to do is I tried to link some of these invasive species kind of in a taxonomic format. So I mentioned the kilkas and the Alosa. And what I thought I'd do is, this is a time for everybody to take a nap right now. Talk a little bit about some herring taxonomy and possibly how you can use some of these things to discriminate between, some of the Eulocines, such as alewife, and possibly the Black Sea shad, and the Clupionella, those kilkas that I reported earlier. And basically, the best way to identify these is looking at the mouth. In the alewife type species, there is a distinctive pointed notch on the upper mouth and a pointed lower jaw, which in the other group, which includes the Clupionella and also what we call the sardines, it's much more rounded. So, I mean, anybody that encounters a suspicious-looking herring type species, this is probably the best way of identifying them, just by looking at the mouth.
So, Max, should people be on the lookout for these things now?
Well, I'll get to that, but okay. Yes, I think they should. There's a lot of value for citizen science monitoring, and certainly the fact that that these researchers identified native surrogate species, wherever you find some of these native surrogates, that would be a great place to focus on in terms of trying to find some of these other ones. Now, of all these fish, this one to me biologically is the most interesting. This was newly identified by this study as a high risk for ballast water survival. And it is a seahorse relative. It's got a very slender body encased by bony rings, has a very broad distribution, and perhaps of all the species that I've mentioned has the largest and most extensive invasion history. Another very interesting thing here, and I'm sure Helen knows a lot more about this than I do, is as a seahorse, it has a brood pouch where it can, the males have the brood pouch where they incubate the eggs within this pouch and providing them a great deal of protection. And like seahorses, they like to anchor themselves with their long tail to vegetation where they feed on prey. And they have a suction tube-like mouth, which enables them to prey on such things as larval fish and small bottom dwelling invertebrates. Where this species was introduced, there were a lot of what we call recruitment problems or survival of larval fish to a larger adult size where these were introduced. This species is capable of producing several broods from a long spawning season from spring to fall. And what's really intriguing here is that after they spawn, they can begin spawning again within 8 days after the previous spawn, which shows that it's a pretty high reproductive rate. Now, another one, this was previously identified by Kohler and Lodge as a high-risk species. This is called the Black Sea silverside, also known as the big-scale sand smelt. Now, the sand smelt is actually a misnomer. This is in no way related to the smelt that we see here in North America. In referring to the species, it's probably best to call it the Black Sea silverside. And it's very closely related to a native silverside that we have here in North America, the brook silverside. And this, like other species, has an extremely broad salinity range, which would enable it to withstand ballast water exchange and perhaps ballast water flushing if it isn't complete. It also has a very broad temperature range, and it also forms very dense schools. And if you remember the earlier slide I showed you on the invasion dynamics or the invasion process, any species that forms dense schools has a very high likelihood of being withdrawn into ballast water in its home ports. Where this species has been introduced, it has been very effective in terms of reducing zooplankton density. And zooplankton are small little, usually crustaceans, members of the crab family. which are essential food items for young developing larval fish. And so wherever these species were introduced and invaded, it reduced zooplankton levels to very, very low densities, and as a result, it affected the survival of fish to adulthood. And this particular species, as a successful invader, it matures very early in life and produces eggs in a series of batches. Instead of spawning all at once, it produces a series of small batches throughout its reproductive cycle. And another unusual thing about it, it has what I call hairy eggs. It has these little hair-like structures on it which enable it to attach to a wide variety of different substrates. Now, we're very glad to see that there's more gobies that could be potentially on our way, and we've had a lot of bad experiences with the round goby and tube-nosed goby, which are already here. This one has been previously identified and as a high invasion risk, which was also confirmed in this particular study. And the only thing I can say about this is that it's a typical goby. It can tolerate brackish and fresh water. It eats a lot of invertebrates. Again, it forms these dense schools, which probably gives it a leg or actually a fin up on getting drawn up into ballast tanks. A very high reproductive output. And the unusual thing about this, it varies in some coloration patterns, but there is some evidence that suggests that it may interbreed with round gobies. But, you know, a lot of people will think, well, what's the big deal with that? Well, I guess looking at this as a biologist, there are things such as known as hybrid vigor. So, you know, how would a hybrid round goby, monkey goby behave? Would it be larger? Would it be more aggressive? It's very hard to say, but nonetheless, the fact that they can interbreed should not be overlooked. Another goby, this is called the Volga dwarf goby. This one was identified as a moderate invasion risk during this particular study. It is more of an open water species, inhabiting the near shore of a lot of water bodies, again like a typical goby, feeding on small invertebrates. However, this one, unlike the other gobies, does not have a propensity for feeding on small fishes. The really unusual thing about this one could be readily identified from other gobies because it has a very transparent body coloration with a series of black flecks on the outside of the body. So this one should be fairly easy to identify should you run across it.
And they're tiny, right?
Yeah, they're very small. They're very small. Now this is another goby. So we have three potential gobies coming to the Great Lakes. This was, in this particular study, newly identified as a moderate invasion risk. And I should point out here, when we talk about moderate or high invasion risk or low invasion risk, we don't really have a percentage or a probability, and that's one of the problems with trying to make some of these predictions. You know, it's not that precise. What was used here in terms of evaluating invasion risk were what we call some of the discriminant analysis scoring system, which is it completely blows my mind. If you have any questions about that, I think that's better described in the resulting paper that came out. This goby is quite distinctive in terms of its physical appearance. It has a very, very large head and a protruding jaw, so this one should be fairly easy to identify. It matures very early in life, probably at least by age 1 in slower growing populations. It probably reproduces a bit later. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this right now in the interest of time, but I'm putting together a goby ID thing here to help identify Some of the gobies that are already here, the round goby and tube-nosed goby, which were Pontocaspian introductions quite some time ago, with some of these predicted goby species. And there are certain body features to look for, such as coloration patterns, but those are so highly variable. The best way to identify these species is with a dissecting scope, and what you actually do is you look at these the arrangement of these small sensory canals at the tip of the head. So anyway, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but there are ways of distinguishing these species.
Are there posters or anything like this?
No, not yet. This is, to my knowledge, I put this together, myself, and I'm going to. There's also, I should have mentioned, there are also at least 2 other species of gobies that were predicted to enter the Great Lakes from previous studies. The star goby, and there's another goby. I'm not from the Pontocaspian. I may put those in as well, but they were not confirmed as a risky species by this particular study. But still, it warrants putting them in. Now, I've left these last 2 species for last simply because they're considered to be a low invasion risk based on their ability to withstand ballast water transport. But that said, the Eurasian minnow could be one of the most disruptive species of all of these should it get introduced into the Great Lakes. Presumably, maybe as you know, the aquarium trade is perhaps the most likely route. This one is a notorious competitor for young trout, and some of the studies have indicated it can reduce trout abundance by as much as 35%. And, you know, those of us that live in and around the Great Lakes, you know, trout and salmon are the major sport fishing targets, and so there is some natural concern about how this species could affect trout and salmon should it get introduced. Now, biologically speaking, this particular species of all of them has the most variable life history strategy. In fact, from population to population, wherever you find these species, they're all different in terms of their lifespans, their growth rates, egg production, size at age, and coloration. So they're the most plastic, I guess, if you will, of all these species in terms of their ability to adjust their life histories to different environments. And typically reaching 5 inches in legs and can live, well, one study indicated it can live up to 10 years of age. It's a small fish, but nonetheless should not be underestimated should it get you. Another species that was previously identified as a risk, but in this particular study was identified as a low risk, and again, risk being associated with its ability to withstand ballast water transport. This is the Eurasian or European perch. Now, the concern here is that if this species is introduced into the Great Lakes, and presumably through an aquarium introduction, you know, the probability of ballast water transport could be pretty low. Is its presumed ability to interbreed with yellow perch. And unlike our native yellow perch, it can withstand mildly brackish conditions and is a lot more tolerant to higher water temperatures and those waters that are more nutrient enriched. And to my knowledge, the only way that you can distinguish these species is to dissect them. You'll notice on the bottom diagram where I have some of the dorsal spine structures comparing Eurasian and yellow perch. And you'll notice this T-shaped bone called the predorsal bone. You'll see that in the yellow perch, this predorsal bone sticks down a lot further into the vertebrae than does the Eurasian perch. But morphologically, that's the only way you can tell the difference between these. Now, an interesting thing about this is that I was very interested in looking at the genetics of Eurasian perch and North American perch. And I'm going to leave this to the genetic experts out there. But a lot of the genes have been coded using a barcode system. And what this represents is the arrangement of the, I guess, the genes, or actually the arrangement of the codes on one particular gene called the cytochrome oxidase gene, which is a very important gene and a frequent target for geneticists to identify between different species. Cytochrome oxidase gene is present in all vertebrates, and it basically helps control light functions. So, I mean, visually, I'm just looking at these two barcode systems of Eurasian perch, but I'll leave this up to the geneticist to figure out if there's any differences between the two. And it doesn't look, at least visually to me, that there is a lot of difference, but again, this has to be looked at. So one of the things that, just some of the results of this particular study, looking at invasion success in terms of ballast water transport, it found, basically, we're talking about, in order to be successfully introduced or have a high risk for ballast transport, these organisms have to have broad salinity tolerances across all their life stages. And we're talking about 28 parts per thousand. That's actually a misprint there. It should be 28 parts per thousand, not 0.28. Full-strength seawater is about 32 to 35, so the salinity is very high. Another thing that we found that some of the factors that favored the establishment of species, of some of these species, is that they had to have a higher growth rate and a known invasion history. Now, if you look below, those factors that favored a spread of these invasion is a lower growth rate and a higher salinity tolerance. Now, you notice establishment and spread, they're two different things here. So it basically tells you that there's really no such thing as a perfect invader. So, I mean, those organisms that are most likely to spread have a lower growth rate. Those that are most likely to establish have a higher growth rate. So there's little buffers, I guess, to compensate between different stages in the introduction process. Those species which are most likely to have a severe negative impact are those with a well-documented invasion history, those with a smaller egg size, which especially include the herring species, and those with a lower minimum temperature tolerance, more typical of the Great Lakes region. So, and again, the essence here is that the life history, ecological characteristics during these various stages of invasion are not always compatible. So again, no such thing as a perfect invader.
Mac, I'm going to stop you for just a second.
Sure.
I had asked if there was any questions from the audience,
okay.
And or if anybody you had mentioned citizen science projects, so I was just kind of curious if anybody had played around with those kinds of concepts, getting, maybe young people or fishermen out there, identifying, and I don't know, I don't know how, if I'm not familiar with any citizen science projects related to fisheries, but one comment that did come back from Sarah Stallman is Pennsylvania has an aquatic invasive species ID field guide with a fish section, and they're working on a smartphone app. They do ID trainings for field staff and agency workers.
That's an excellent idea, and this is Sarah Stallman that sent this comment in. Yes, I mean that's really a very important part of this whole early warning system. If we can get citizen scientists trained on how to identify these species, where to look, what habitats are they most likely to be found, just the basic guidelines. If you find a fish that you don't recognize, there are ways of, telling whether it could be a potential invader or not. So yeah, I think this is what Pennsylvania Sea Grant is doing is really an excellent thing. Now, if we can combine some of this citizen science with using a technique called eDNA, where you actually can go out and take water samples and detect the presence of some of these species and some of their native indicator species with the DNA that they release. That really adds a lot to the ability to detect these species. And that can be very easily done by a group of trained citizen scientists, at least the water collection process. So the second phase of this, which really hasn't been published, was, all right, so we know that there's a risk of some of these species coming over here. So let's take a look at some of these high-risk invaders, again, based on their ability to withstand ballast water transport and where they're most likely to be found. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I've been given the high sign that I don't have a lot of time left. And this is a notorious thing that I do. I always have like 52 gazillion slides and not enough time to present them. But what I wanted to do was spend a little bit of time at looking at some of these efforts that are underway to identify high-risk habitat zones where you're most likely to find some of these species, as well as on the left you'll see of the chart, you see European ports with significant shipping traffic to the Great Lakes, and we do know that some of these high-risk species are found in each of these ports. I wanted to point out on this chart that the ports, the home ports, do not correspond to any particular port in the Great Lakes. This is just a group of ports where these species could be coming from, and the list on the right is just a list of ports that are most likely to where these some of these species have been introduced. So far, the only port that's been really looked at is Duluth, Minnesota, simply because it receives a great deal of international shipping. And what we discovered in this study is that there are a series of indicator species which have very similar life histories and ecology to some of these predicted invasive species, such as the monkey goby, sand smelt, and black pipefish. So if we know where some of these indicator species are found, this would be a good place to target some of your monitoring efforts, where to look for some of these predicted invaders. And this is exactly what was done in this study in Duluth Harbor. This is a map that was produced by EPA that shows the various habitat types. And also in this study was published, some information on fish community structure, where you're most likely to find several species. Well, the whole structure of the fish community in Duluth and Superior. So what the researchers did is they looked at what we know about monkey goby in terms of its habitat match, and we see that a considerable portion of the habitats present in the St. Louis River area or Duluth Harbor could be areas where to focus efforts to look for monkey goby. And if we look at, similarly, the presence of local indicator species, there's a fairly good matchup between the habitat and where the local indicator species are found. And this was repeated both for the big-scale sand smelt. Again, this is based on habitat match and the presence of local indicator species. So it's a pretty good matchup there. Similarly, for the black-striped pipefish, again, this is based on knowing what we know about its habitat preferences, where it's successfully invaded, and what we do know about some of the local native indicator species and where to focus some monitoring efforts. So, Ivial Zhukanya, which means in conclusion, and I hope there's nobody who speaks Russian here because I really butchered that pronunciation. Again, in this study, there was 4 high potential, 4 moderate potential, 2 low potential invaders identified. And again, remember, this is based on their ability to withstand ballast water transport. And those species with the highest salinity tolerances, those particularly the 4 high potential, again, 28 parts per thousand, greater than 28 parts per thousand across all life history stages, are most likely to survive ballast water exchange. And I should point out here that with the ballast water management, that includes, oceanic exchange and flushing, that has probably reduced the potential of invasive species through ballast coming to North America by at least 70%. So again, while we call these high potential, moderate potential, and too low potential invaders, it's, if we had those ballast water regulations in place, we probably would not have had the problems we've had with invasive species that we had now. But trying to associate the, the ballast water management with the potential for these species getting over here is pretty tough to correlate. However, what we can say is that the potential is probably significantly lower than before these mandatory ballast water regulations were put into effect. I'm just going to skip through here. You saw in one of my earlier slides that the life history ecological characteristics at each invasion stage are not always compatible. Again, there's no such thing as a perfect invader. Most invasions fail, and of those invasions that are successful, only about 10 to 15% of it have some really significant negative impacts. We cannot overlook the fact that there are native indicator species already here in the Great Lakes that can be surrogates on, what habitats to look for, or to set up some early monitoring systems to look for some of these potential invaders. And as I mentioned before, the overall likelihood of ballast-borne invasions is lower because of ballast water exchange and some of these other mandatory regulations which were put into effect. And I think the compliance rate for those regulations is somewhere between 95 and 97%. So it is pretty high. So the next steps, and I guess I kind of extrapolate a little bit from these studies, was that I think we need to revise those existing watch lists for high-risk species to include some of these predicted invaders. Again, monitor some of these preferred habitats based on what we know about them and the presence of some of the native indicator species. And very important is develop what we call environmental DNA tools, which basically you can detect the presence of indicator species and some of these potential invaders by simply taking water samples. And there are some new techniques out here, in fact, one pioneered by Cornell University that can provide you with results within 2 hours. And it's a lot more sensitive and about four times cheaper than the methods that are currently being used right now. So, and what we also feel that we need to expand this study and collect more information on other potential invaders, and to obtain what we call samples from what we call voucher specimens from the Pono-Caspian region, where we actually have hands-on specimens, preserved specimens of these particular species.
So Mac, I'm going to stop you here because those next steps seem like there's potential there for cooperative extension educators
Absolutely.
and community groups to work with you
Right.
on something. So how
Absolutely.
can they stay tuned in to what's happening?
Well, I think there's, stay on Sea Grant websites. I mean, Helen Dobsky is one of our best educators, and she deals a lot with high school students, high school teachers, and also stay in contact with some of the other Sea Grant programs out there. We also publish a lot of information on our own Sea Grant website. So there's a lot of intensive effort out there. Citizen science is going to be increasingly important for, developing early warning systems and early detection for these species.
Okay.
Let's see. And there's a paper that summarizes the result of this research. It's in the Journal of Great Lakes Research. Volume 40 just came out a few months back, and just want to leave you with this thought. Here's a new potential invasive species for our watch list. It's called the Amur sleeper. It's actually a close relative of both the perch and the gobies. It's been known in the Russian literature as the perfect conqueror because it has an ability to withstand a broad variety of different environmental conditions, and it is notorious for virtually eradicating amphibian populations because it feeds on young amphibians and the larvae and eggs. So where this species was introduced, amphibian populations were all but extirpated. So with that, Большое спасибо and Boka. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. This is great. I'm just going to go on to a closing slide that has some upcoming Campus County Connection webinars. But if you're out there and you have some questions, feel free to chat them in. We have another moment or so. If you've tuned into Campus County Connection webinars before, you know we try to cover a variety of topics that relate to things that happen within Cornell Cooperative Extension, both research and extension, really. And the idea is that we're, sharing both research that's happening tied to campus and the land grant system, and some good work that's happening out in the county. So we have a new website. So organizational development has a new website. You'll be getting a notice about that in the next couple of days. But from the staff site, you'll be able to click on Campus County Connections and see from there a list of the program work teams, Research Navigator link, funded research and extension projects, and then below our upcoming webinars that fall within the Campus County Connection webinar series. There's also links to all of the recent, well, actually, the last 3 years of Campus County Connection webinars that have been recorded are up there, as well as any of the handouts and slides that we've covered. So look for that in the coming days. You'll be able to link to this webinar as well. I'm not seeing any questions coming in. Do you have any final words?
No, just thanks a lot for your attention. And if you need any more information, just drop me an email, and be happy to respond to them as best I can. Again, if you have any questions of a statistical nature, the emails of the principal investigators on these studies is included on the opening slide.
So, what's your email address?
It's dbm4@cornell.edu.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you, folks.